Officer present. You may continue, Mr.
Okay. So one of the things I did want to bring up, and it's going to come up again when I talk about the timeline a little bit on the 23rd, but again, independent evidence that connects the defendant to the crime of murder and the conspiracy. And here you can see on the slide, it says lies about text alert from safe. So, again, just pulling out little pieces to try to put them in context. Remember when the defendant is first interviewed on the night of the murder, January 23rd, just across the street, right? And we know she's over there with the daughters, and they interview her alone in a room, and then they interview the daughters, and they have a conversation with her about various things. And then remember the testimony of Corey Hawk, who now works for the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. And at the time of the murder, Corey Hawk was working for LAPD's crime lab. And she was working in the field investigation unit, and she was called out to the crime scene to process the scene with her partner Matt Salcedo, and Detective Verna flew in and testified about how that works, how crime scenes like a homicide scene get processed, and how it's a collaborative effort so that they understand, what they're looking for and what might be relevant and what not. And one of the things that I mentioned yesterday was that the crime scene was obviously staged, and I talked about the reasons that support that, and that there was blood evidence on items in the master bedroom, which is the only room that's ransacked, which also is part of that support for that proposition. But the blood evidence on those items indicates murder happens first, right? Which means it's not a burglar. Nobody's breaking into burglarized. Targeted hit. So Corey Hawk said that when she went into the master bedroom, it appeared to her that the master bedroom walk-in closet was untouched. It was undisturbed. And they were told by the defendant, remember she does a walkthrough the next morning, I think it's with Detective Gutierrez, Efren Gutierrez, and Bucknell, and on their way out they're showing her, like, we processed this, and there's fingerprint powder here, and this was swabbed, and we took certain items, and so on and so forth. And Corey Hawk says that she did not swab anything on the safe because it was undisturbed. So she was going to leave that. She thought the surface material of the safe was better left for latents, right? And so latent prints, meaning prints that are not visible to the eye. You have to dust them with black powder or use some other type of processing that makes those latent prints patent or visible. And so the defendant also is interviewed January 23rd, and then remember there's a phone call, and we played you her recorded calls, and you can go back through all the transcripts and the recordings. But they keep going back to the 20th and the 21st because the crime scene doesn't make sense, because it's a staged scene and the Rolex is on the wrist. And so she says, again, on May 18th, and remember this is the date that detectives Parshall and Verna bring in robbery homicide detectives Chris Gable and his partner at that time, Barry Tellis, and they are working together, but the ruse that they are using is that these are detectives that are working on a knock-knock burglar task force, remember? Because the minute you bring up, oh, these guys are from robbery homicide division, it has a different it sits different, right? And they don't want to blow what they know is now going on, because now they've accessed records and things like that. And robbery homicide is moving in to take over. And so they go through the scene with the defendant. They come to the house, May 18th, 2017. They walk through the house, and you can hear the recording is in Detective Gable's pocket, his jacket pocket. And so you can sometimes hear it's muffled, but you hear them all talking, and we played it through him, and he testified about it. And they go into the closet, and they're talking about, before they're in the closet, they're in the master bedroom, and they're talking about the slider and whether it was locked or unlocked and things of that nature, which obviously either the front door, as I said, is either unlocked or the slider door is left unlocked. Because remember, Baker says, I was going to go around the back because I know it's always unlocked. And my question to him was, well, you've said to us before that you've only been there twice. The night that you were so drunk that she had to bring you home because you were puking all over the place, and you slept in her bed, which we know is a BS story because Fabio's out of town. And so Jessica tells Deborah Obad, as Obad says, blabbermouth Jessica told her Monica didn't come home till 1 or 2 in the morning that night. And Monica, the defendant, tells Jessica that Sheila and Rob both slept over because she wants to make it sound innocuous, but Sheila left earlier. And then we know, of course, Sheila's never been there until that Thursday after the murder, when she comes over with Rob Baker to pay a condolence call. But they go into the master bedroom walk-in closet, and the defendant shows them the safe. And remember, I asked Baker about this because it's hidden. We're going to get to a slide that shows it, but I want to bring it up now because I see it here on my slide. There is a mirror, a long mirror, that is behind the master bedroom closet, walk-in closet door. So it's hidden. Not only is it behind the door, but it's also hidden behind a mirror. And the defendant tells the detectives that every time the mirror opens, there's a sensor attached to the mirror. Whenever the mirror is opened, she gets a text to her phone, right? And she says that that alerts her that someone has opened the mirror because behind the mirror is the safe, right? And she says, but I didn't get one that day. I didn't get one on the 23rd of January. I did not get a text, meaning no one opened the mirror or the safe on January 23rd, right? Well, then you heard that and saw, again, putting together pieces that might not have made sense at the time. There is a text that does come to her phone on January 23rd, and it comes at 2:03. And where is the defendant? At 2:03 on January 23rd. She's home. Who opens the safe? The defendant does. Fabio's working from home. He's not fiddling around with the safe. And what does she tell the detectives is kept in the safe? There's no reason for Fabio to be opening the safe. Fabio's gun, certainly not taking out his gun on January 23rd and playing with his gun. His gold coins, and some money, right? And then Baker gets on the stand, and Baker says, well, there were gold coins. They were sitting out on the patio. Remember that ridiculous story? And there was paperwork from the gold coins. And so I took all of that. How, again, coincidental is that he knows he needs to pay Austin, and Austin knows that, as he testified, Fabio is a collector of things such as gold coins. And lo and behold, Fabio's got the gold coins just sitting next to him out there on the patio while Fabio is working, because maybe Fabio just wants to, I don't know, sit out there and admire them or read through paperwork about gold coins. And in his rush to get out the door, because now they're in this short time frame window that I've talked about, this slim window that has to be shoehorned, manufactured, manipulated by the defendant to make it work. Austin and Baker commit the murder. They have to lie in wait for a time when they, as Baker said, when they're going to decide to rush out through the door from the kitchen onto the patio to take Fabio by surprise, lying in wait. And once they do that, they both, Austin says he turns around, like he barely has time to like open his eyes, and Baker's already in the house and gone because, again, they've got a short time frame, and Baker's off because he's got to now stage the crime. He's cut himself. He's taken the bleach out from underneath the sink. He's trying to clean up his own blood so as not to leave any DNA behind, which doesn't work. And he runs into the back bedroom to strew things, objects about to make it look like something, but he's bleeding and because of the knife wound, and he's leaving his own blood and transferring Fabio's blood because of plunging the knife into Fabio. And so he's leaving his own blood and Fabio's blood on various objects, as you heard about from the DNA expert. So at 2:03, before the defendant leaves for Target, she opens the safe, right? Oh, one more thing. Baker, after this story that he tells on the stand about the gold coins and the paperwork just happened to be sitting out on the patio with Fabio at that time, and lo and behold, oh my God, I got to pay Chris Austin. I'll just scoop those up, put them in my pocket. He tells the defense, remember he said, oh, that guy's lying, I didn't say that, or he didn't write it down right, or whatever. On a prior occasion, he said the gold coins were in the house. And he's like, well, they were in the house because they were in my pocket. And so therefore I said it was in the house because they... Anyway, it just got worse and worse, and he kept doubling down, and it just got worse and worse. But anyway, 2:03, the defendant opens the safe, right? And we know those are the only things in there because that's what she tells law enforcement. So why would Fabio be opening the safe? We know why Monica is opening the safe, because she's going to, after the murder, as we heard from Detective Verna, she's going to report the $11,000 or so in cash, which can never be traced, and costume jewelry that has no value, and gold coins as the objects that were taken during the course of this burglary that somehow turned into a murder, right? Except the murder comes first, so the story doesn't work. So she goes in, she takes the gold coins out, and then what does she do? She does the same thing that we saw her do every time she did anything that pointed to her complicity in this crime. She deletes the text from the phone, right? You heard about that. So in the deletions column on her Celebrate extraction report, the safe opening does not come up when we dump her phone. So when we extract the data from her cell phone for January 23rd, it doesn't show anything that would indicate that her phone received a text from the mirror safe, right? So how do we find out about that? Well, we subpoena from AT&T these records that are called mobility records. Remember when I talked about the mobility records in this case? And lo and behold, when we get the mobility records, and when I say from AT&T, because remember, she's got her iPhone records. These are separate records. These go to AT&T, as she tells Detective Gable. It's called Digital Life, and it's some service that they signed up for so that when the mirror sensor is triggered and opened, so that you know someone's accessing the safe, the text goes to her phone, and lo and behold, the mobility records show that at 2:03 on January 23rd, a text went to her phone. So she then deletes it, right? Because she's got to cover up why she'd be going into the safe earlier on the day when her husband just happens to get murdered. All right. Then on top of all the other evidence, as I mentioned, we heard numerous admissions, statements by Baker, where he says in the recorded jailhouse lockup, courthouse lockup, that he's going to take the blame, he's going to take the fall for the defendant. So when I talk about accomplice corroboration, just going back for a couple so you can see, I mean, I've got numerous slides of it. I'm sure you can come up with additional items. So you can kick that around back there. But that's one of the requirements under the law, is that there has to be independent evidence that tends to connect the defendant to the commission of the crime. So now I want to talk a little bit more about Christopher Austin. As you heard, he's got no prior record. He pled guilty in this case based on what he admitted to the second-degree murder, along with the use of a knife. I talked yesterday about the fact that his plea negotiations are dependent on his truthful and complete testimony at trial. Who makes that call? Not me. And that he provided information about January 22nd, the first attempted hit on Fabio that we never ever heard about from Baker. And he's interviewed numerous times. It's not until they go in there and they say to Baker, hey, they now have Austin. And he's telling them that you guys went out to this strip mall and tried to kill Fabio the night before he was killed. Oh. And by the way, they have forensic evidence that puts you there. So now what does he do? He tries to construct a story around the evidence, which is what I accused him of doing numerous times on the stand. So you know how that went down. And so when you think about Christopher Austin, and I expect you'll spend some time back there talking about various witnesses, including Christopher Austin, and you should, because he is an accomplice, and you need to make sure that you believe his testimony. Same thing you have to do with Baker. And you might think a lot of things about Christopher Austin, and you might also be divided on what y'all think. I mean, maybe you think he's a horrible person who should obviously have refused to help Baker commit a murder. Maybe you think he's just as guilty as Baker, and so therefore he deserves the same sentence, that he should spend the rest of his life in prison, life without parole, like Baker. Maybe you think we gave him too light of a deal. Maybe you think the indeterminate sentence of 16 to life, meaning he might not get out for decades because it's indeterminate, was too heavy. Maybe you think we were too harsh. Maybe you feel bad for him. Maybe you think he did what he did out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to Baker. Maybe you think he's an idiot. Maybe you think he came across as contrite and that he's likely going to live with the guilt of what he did for the rest of his life. And those are all things that are interesting to ponder and food for probably ample conversation back there. But whether you like him or not is irrelevant. The question is, do you believe him? Does what he said, what he testified to, what he stated in his proffer over 2 different dates make sense? Is it consistent? Is it supported by other evidence? And I just spent some time today talking about accomplice corroboration. Does his demeanor tell you that it's likely he's telling the truth? Or maybe you came away thinking he's a habitual liar just like Baker, not to be trusted. It's fine. You can come to the same conclusion on this case that we had before we had Austin, looking at all the evidence that I just talked about with you, all the independent evidence when you take Austin out of the case and look at what's left. But what we did learn about from Austin is this small window of time that he learned from Baker. And we know that the defendant and Baker had to come up with an alternate plan after January 22nd didn't go down as they had planned. And so they are now looking to try and find another window, as Baker said, another window of opportunity where they're ready to go on a moment's notice when he gets information from the defendant. And so we know that Monday might not have been an ideal time because we heard that Fabio was supposed to have some sort of a colonoscopy appointment that day. That's why he was working from home. We also heard that Delia, Miss Rivera, is there that day cleaning, so we've got to wait for her to clean. The defendant has to get Jessica out of the house to the Obad's home to babysit. And we know that Baker and Austin are going to have to complete the murder and get out of there before Isabella returns from school. And so they also have the opportunity to delay her a little longer by sending her to pick up the eyeglasses from the eye doctor. We also know, obviously, from looking at the job that Baker did, that he had to rush, just as he said, the staging of the crime scene, because we heard about, and we'll talk about the defendant sending that last message to him via Viber at 4:46, right? And so how else would Baker know when that specific window would be? Because I just went through a litany of various individuals that you're going to have to work around in order to make that opportune time fit. You're talking about a time period of a little less or a little more maybe than a half an hour. We know they're turning from Oakdale onto Queen Victoria at 4:18, and they still have to get up to the house. They still got to figure out which door they're going to go in, which obviously Baker has to know about ahead of time. As Austin said, they knew that the defendant was leaving the door open for them. And then they also have to sneak through the house to be careful about where Fabio might be, because he might, bless you, not still be out on the back patio. And so, again, all of this requires an incredible amount of timing and manipulation of the time period. And then you also have to think not just about how Baker and Austin, because Baker has to go back, pick up Austin, they've got to get the rental car, Austin in the rental car, they've got to drive over to the location, which is, you heard from the detectives from the SIS surveillance crew, is a few miles away, and they have to park that car and then jog up from there to the house. And so in order to determine that precise time period, you have to believe that they also knew, going through all of these efforts, that Fabio, let's say, is not out like he was earlier that morning, still trying to get the power washer fixed. We saw him driving out earlier in the morning, and then he texts the defendant while she's at LA Fitness saying that he's back. And she asked if he got it fixed. We know he went out the day before also with Ernie to try and get it fixed. Whether he's going out for lunch, whether he's going to stop at the office, whether he has other errands to run. And so the only one who knows what everybody's schedule is that day, the family and Miss Rivera, is the defendant. That information, that specific time window, time frame, specific, precise, short period during that day where Baker knows he has to be ready to go, has to be provided by the defendant. And as I mentioned, Austin said that Baker told him she left him alone. We have to go now. She's going to the store. And that's exactly what she does in order to make an alibi. And so remember also in the proffer statement, the two-day proffer the defense played for you, that Austin also specified that Baker told him the victim should be on the patio as they jogged up to the home that day, which of course he was. Where do you think that information came from? And so again, as I mentioned, you should look, bless you, at the evidence that corroborates Christopher Austin, as I've gone through today, in various areas of his testimony, to show that what he says is credible, that you can rely, bless you, on his testimony that he gave. And so, again, we have all of this evidence with respect to not just the 23rd, but also the 22nd, where the same thing happens. And we know that there are messages based on the testimony of Cyree going back and forth between starting out with the defendant and Fabio with respect to, she tells him obviously she wants pho. He starts looking at pho near me. He instant messages her. She looks it up. She sends him an address. They go, Baker and Austin, out to that strip mall, and they wait there for Fabio, knowing he's going to come. And then Cyree tells us, even though Baker says, oh no, I left my phone home that day because I didn't want to be tracked. We know that's BS, because Cyree says, oh no, he and Monica, he and the defendant, are messaging 69 times during that time period, while Baker is waiting in the parking lot for Fabio to show up. So almost 70 times they're going back and forth, while Monica is updating him as to the status. And how do we know? How does anybody know that maybe Fabio is going to say, you know what, I don't feel like Vietnamese tonight. I don't want pho. I want Mexican. Right? So she has to get him to go where she wants him to go, where she's been communicating with Baker for 2.5 hours as they're sitting there in this parking lot, waiting for Fabio to show up. And remember what Austin says? While we're there, he says, oh, he should be here now. So he's getting real-time communications from the defendant as to where Fabio is. And that's when Austin gets out of the car from the back lot at this strip mall, walks down a couple of steps, or up a couple of steps through this alleyway that we saw, through the pillars, and finds this location looking for the vehicle Baker described, which Baker didn't even get right in his testimony. Remember, he's like, it's the Porsche, and I led him down this path with the Porsche, and how he had the GPS on the Porsche, and he knew it was the Porsche, and he described the Porsche to Austin. And then I said, well, how did you describe the Porsche? Well, it's a black Porsche. Well, what if I told you he wasn't driving the Porsche that night? He was driving the Ford F-150. Well, that can't be right. And Austin tells us he's driving the Ford F-150. He told me it was a dark color, blue or black Ford F-150. Show me a picture of the guy. Said he was a big guy. So again, you have all of that evidence. So now let's talk about Baker. We talked about the fact that he's a convicted sex offender. He tried to lie to you about the charges that he pled to in that case. We know that he tried to lie to you and claim he didn't know what he was convicted of in this case. We know that he came up with more than a dozen stories. There's probably more than several dozen stories in his ridiculous letter alone that I went painstakingly through with him, line by line, to bring out all the relevant facts to show you how ridiculous that initial story was, that he took all this time, a day, to write out for the defense attorneys, claiming he wanted them to give it to Monica because this was his apology letter about how he said Fabio attacked him in the house and he didn't see it coming and knocked him out, but then he went into this unconscious rage and killed Fabio. But then Fabio would be dead in the house, and it was a ridiculous story. So obviously he had to go back and come up with other versions. So we heard about that, but no matter how many versions he told, he still never got to the truth. And of course, the other problem we have is, instead of getting a court order to bring in a laptop to show him things, they didn't get a court order. Maybe they just didn't want to get a court order to show him, not just to show him things on the laptop, but to record him. You can get a court order to record him, so that we would have that, like LAPD provided. So you would know exactly what was said, and we could play those in court for him, and you would have a record, a real-time record of what exactly he said, and you didn't have to worry about what some investigator wrote in his notes and then didn't write in his report and then destroyed his notes, or put in his report and didn't put in his notes, and back and forth 100 times. There's a very simple way of ensuring that the evidence is what you say it is and being able to prove it. You record it. So, again, we know he's a compulsive liar. We know that he devised this elaborate story one after another to try and sell you, thinking that you would buy it, and, I pushed the button maybe a few too many times during his testimony, but here we are. We also know that the defendant and Baker devised an elaborate scheme, just as they did on the outside prior to the murder and after the murder, before they were taken into custody. They did the same type of planning and scheming to be able to secretly communicate once they were apprehended. You heard about that in detail, excruciating detail, from Detective Mitzi Roberts. They used other inmates' PIN numbers, just like they used encrypted apps, so they could communicate secretly by sending jail letters to each other through other inmates' names, by using other inmates' PIN numbers to make what they referred to as clean calls, so the calls wouldn't be traced back to them. They called through third parties. They figured out times by sending letters to one another that they would either destroy, as we heard them talking about, or that they would hide in other inmates' bunks. And you heard about, in one recording, the defendant claiming that the other inmates in her cell area, the room that she was housed in, they were all angry at her because everybody's bunks kept being tossed because she was hiding jail letters from Baker in other people's places to prevent them from being found and traced back to her. You also heard about the fact that Robert Baker has been sentenced to life without parole. That means that, as I talked to him on the stand, we can't punish him or do anything to him if he lies. He's already got the maximum sentence, right? So no repercussions. It's a freebie. He can get up here, treat this courtroom like his own sandbox, and treat it with the contempt and the disrespect that he did, and lie minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day, and it just never ended. And so, it's very difficult. When you lie, when you're a habitual compulsive liar, it's very difficult to keep track of your lies because they're not based on anything when you look back and try to remember. If you have an event in your head and you tell somebody about that event, every time it comes up, there might be additional things that you recall, there might be details you might forget over time, but the event is the event. When you're making up things out of whole cloth from the beginning, there is nothing to look back on in your memory to draw from. And so the story just keeps changing. So again, these are various things, as I talked about earlier, that the judge is going to instruct you on some of the factors you can take into account in determining the credibility of a witness. Remember how he said over and over, well, I can't remember. This was 8 years ago. This was so long ago. How am I supposed to remember? And compare that to Christopher Austin, where, I'm going to tell you this is what I can remember, but then this other part here with the Vegas, I remember going to the Arya. I remember, going to her house. I remember meeting her at LA Fitness, but I can't tell you that I met her at that point in time. So, again, the refusal to answer certain questions. What's his motive to lie? Well, that was recorded for you. For forever, 10 years from now, it'll still be recorded for you. He wants to get her out. And we heard about some of the motivation, such as her being able to support him from the outside, especially once she gets the money. We heard their talk about some of these sex acts the two of them would perform for one another in the lockup. And he talked about, well, that's just jailing, I think he said. That's just how you do jail. You both show your private parts, you ejaculate. You heard them on one of the recorded calls where she says, "Oh my God, baby, how did you do that?" And he's like, "Well, it took some time." And she's like, "Oh, I need paint. Give me some paint." They're talking about how he got his semen into this trial-size toothpaste tube that he then passes to her. And I don't know what she was planning on doing with it, and I'm not gonna go there. I'm sure you can sit around and dream up all sorts of things. But again, we're talking about two extremely narcissistic, depraved individuals who have convinced themselves that the big bad government, the big bad system, those dirty, lying police officers, prosecutor, are just making up evidence because they did nothing other than have an affair and fell in love. And so you hear them saying that nice and loudly for the recording devices over and over and over. And I think y'all know by now, we all got better things to do. So, again, various things that you can take into account in determining witness credibility. But again, comparison, right? Christopher Austin, Robert Baker. You don't have to use either one of them. I'm totally fine. You want to throw out Austin? You feel like he didn't give you anything? Throw him out. I don't care. You got plenty of other evidence in this case. However, when you do like a comparative analysis between the two of them, I mean, you're talking night and day, right? And it was made even more apparent when you had Austin on the stand day after day undergoing cross-examination. You didn't see that guy blowing his top. I mean, I might have blown my top at some point because my patience level over the years has definitely decreased. I get yelled at, but that's okay. But he didn't. He didn't blow his top, Mr. Austin, when he was asked the same story over and over and over again. He didn't say, "I'm getting out of here. I'm done answering these questions." He didn't have to be told by the judge to sit down. He didn't have to have you removed from the courtroom while the judge had a little talk with the witness in private so he could explain the facts of life and have what I sometimes call a come to Jesus moment. That didn't happen with Mr. Austin, right? So, you can do that. You can do that little comparative analysis. You had Austin on the stand, then, a little while later you had Baker on the stand, and then, lo and behold, you get the gift of getting Austin back on the stand again, and then that comparative analysis became even more clear after listening to Mr. Baker for a few days. But there's another instruction the judge is going to give you, and the instruction talks to you or instructs you what you can do if you find that a witness is willfully false. In other words, if you find that you have a witness who lies under oath or is willfully false, as Mr. Baker admitted over and over in his testimony or denied, depending on what part it was, the law says that if you find that there is a witness who is materially false. Now, I'm not talking about when he lies about something that's not material. I'm talking about, the meat and potatoes. When you have somebody who is willfully false about a material aspect of the evidence in the case, that witness should be distrusted, right? Which makes, again, sense under the law. Common sense. If you have a witness who is lying to you over and over and over, I mean, at some point, you might be able to find some little kernels in there that you can rely on because they're corroborated independently by other evidence. But what the law says is that if you find that there's a witness who is willfully false in a material part of their testimony, they should be distrusted in other parts of their testimony. And then the law goes further. And the law says that if you find that to be the case with somebody like Robert Baker, that you can then reject the entire testimony of that witness. You can take your little notepads and you can just cross that stuff right on out and move on to the next piece of evidence. So when I hear that instruction, that's given in every case. I think of a piece of moldy bread. So when you have a piece of moldy bread, you're not going to cut around the mold and use the rest of it. You're going to take that piece of bread and you're going to throw it away, right? That is at your discretion. That is your choice. You're the jurors who are, as I said earlier, the judges of what the facts are. Oh, one more thing, and I'm sure this didn't escape you, but also recall one of the tactics Mr. Baker thought was useful was to claim and make a distinction between when he spoke to the defense investigators and, as Mr. Levine said, asked him or told him over and over, we're not going to call you unless you tell the truth, and then he would lie. Then they'd come back and they'd say, we're not going to call you unless you tell the truth, and then he'd lie. And then they'd come back and they'd do the same song and dance, right, 12 times. And so after 12 of those, he still manages to get onto the stand because, well, we told you so, sir, right? And then he does this, makes this distinction, and he says to you, well, I took some law classes, and it's okay if I lie because those were unofficial statements. But now this is an official statement. Okay, you're not going to see anything, I can promise you, you're not going to see anything in any of the law that the judge is going to give you that's going to make a distinction between official and unofficial statements. In fact, I'll go even further. Official and unofficial, those terms do not appear in the law. Okay? There's truth and there's a lie. And you remember where it became so ridiculous that I held up my pen and I said, I'm holding up my pen here. Can you see this? If I were to tell you this pen is blue, is that the truth or a lie? Right? Just trying to bring it down to like maybe terms he can understand. All right. We already talked, I think, about Matt Nurse, so I'm going to, you heard from Elise, we talked about the racquetball people. I'm going to go past that. We heard that the defendant and Baker went on numerous double dates. You can see them here with Sheila Salehian and Ricardo Cabrera. You remember Sheila testified about the fact that the defendant and Robert Baker, prior to the murder, were very affectionate with one another. They held hands a lot. They were always touching one another. They were hugging. They were kissing. And that although Sheila and Ricardo knew the defendant was married, this was a very interesting piece of information. The defendant never mentioned Fabio. Never mentioned him. Even after the murder. Never mentioned him. And remember when Sheila says she goes over with Baker when they first saw him at the gym that week after the murder, which would have been Thursday the 26th. They follow Baker and Matt Nurse over to the Sementilli home. And when Sheila is about ready to leave for the evening with Ricardo, she gives the defendant a hug. And what does the defendant say to her when she is in the middle of this grieving period 3 days after her husband's murder? Take care of Rob for me. Okay. The other thing Sheila tells us is that neither the defendant nor Baker ever mentioned her daughters. They just weren't part of the equation. Okay? I'm going to skip through this. You've seen this. These are photos that were taken in Robert Baker's underground parking garage. And you'll have these photographs available to you as well. All right. Let's talk about the DVR a little bit. If you remember at the beginning, towards the beginning of the case, we heard from Mr. Khan. Sean Abdul Khan is the owner of First Digital. That on June 28th of 2016, he went out to the home to install a new home surveillance system and some new cameras. We heard Fabio was not there that day. And at some point, we know the defendant took over the communications with Mr. Khan via email and approved the contract for the upgraded system. This is Exhibits 128, as well as 135 and 136. And one of the things the defendant specifically wanted was the ability to access the camera system remotely from her iPhone. And so that is why Khan spent time showing her how to use remote access and how the IDMSS Lite app worked as he testified. And so he goes over to the home on June 28th. He installs with his installer 4 new cameras, as well as a new monitor in the kitchen and a new DVR box. And remember, he's talking about this is those slimline, because this is now 2017, it's not those big bookish DVRs, it's a slimline box, and he installs that in the cabinet in the garage above the cabinet. And so there's 5 cameras in total. He doesn't replace, there's a camera, an old camera at the intercom near the gate. And he hooks that camera up as the 5th camera to the system and the DVR box as well, so that they can see it on the monitor. Those are Exhibits 129 through 134. And this gives you the idea of the angle of each of those cameras that the defendant would be able to view from her remote access as she was at Target a little bit later that day, on the day of the murder. This is June 28th. And so, as I mentioned, did my battery die? I don't know. It's not moving. Just when I was picking up speed. Again, when we talk about the that new DVR box, it's, as Detective Gable and Detective Vernon noted, it was not something that would be easily visible above that cabinet in the garage. We know Baker's relatively short at 5'7", but both Vernon and Gable, when they were asked, well, what evidence did you have? Why did you think the defendant was involved? They both talked about the fact that that DVR box was in an area out of the line of sight. So if a visitor were to come to the home, it wasn't something you would automatically see. Someone would have had to tell you about it. And of course, as I talked about yesterday, even Ms. Rivera didn't know where it was. And then, if you recall, I had this long, I can see, this long string of questions with Mr. Baker on the stand, where he wanted you to believe so badly that he just followed the wires from the kitchen to the box. And then we showed him the photographs of the monitor in the kitchen, and there's no wires, right? And he's like, oh, no, I didn't mean in the kitchen. I meant in the garage. Well, where in the garage? Well, coming through the wall. Okay, well, what if it's not coming through the wall? Well, then it was coming through the ceiling, but there were wires. I followed the wires. Okay, so there's no wires in the kitchen. The wires up above you wouldn't be able to see behind the box. There were no wires there either, coming from the wall, coming from the ceiling, coming from any place that was visible. This was a professional install company. All the wires are hidden. And then the other point I want to make about that DVR box was that obviously the DVR was taken because the defendant had to have told Baker that it's not a cloud-based system. So in other words, the it's okay. Wasn't a cloud-based system, so that meant once you take the box, you take any recording, right? Because otherwise, if it was a cloud-based system, taking the box doesn't get you anywhere, right? Because it's already been uploaded, it uploads to the cloud, there would be no purpose. And so how would he know that? How would he know that it's not a cloud-based system, so that he would actually take the time as he's running around the house trying to stage the scene, clean up his own blood, goes into the garage, and then he makes this attempt to turn off the power so he can yank the DVR box, and then has to pull the manual release to drive the Porsche out. Why would he have the time to do all that if he didn't know that the DVR wasn't cloud-based? And that, again, would be based on inside information that had to have come from the defendant. Here you can see the kitchen. One thing, and on the left you can see the wires are left loose up there for where the DVR box. Remember when this was shown to various people? Well, there's the DVR box, and Detective Gable kept saying, no, sir, the DVR box isn't there. That's a crime scene photo. These are both crime scene photos. DVR box is gone. It was taken on January 23rd. So the only thing that you're seeing up there is wires. There is no DVR box, okay? And you can see on the right, the monitor, there's no wires, okay? Now, one thing I do want to bring up while we're on this slide, because I don't know that we're going to show it again, but remember placard number 12, and remember the purpose from Corey Hawk with respect to the placards? The placards are to identify stains, right? Areas where she collected red stains that tested positive. We talked about presumptive tests that they can use for blood. And there's a stain on the drawer there that dripped down that was placed there by Robert Baker. And what we heard was that Fabio, even though Baker said, oh no, the keys were on the counter, obviously the reason Baker's blood is on, or Fabio, I don't remember if it's Fabio now, or Baker's blood is on that drawer there near the monitor, is because that's the drawer where Fabio kept his keys, which again, how does Baker know in his haste to stage the crime scene now, remove the DVR box, and also get the car keys? He'd have no other reason why he would open that drawer but for the fact that, again, he had inside information. And then, of course, Ms. Obed tries to change her testimony and say, oh, no, I don't remember it being that drawer. I think it was further this way. The monitor has been moved. Okay, again, just like we said with Baker, these are crime scene photos. This is the location of where the monitor was at the time of the crime. Everything is photographed in place so that, again, 8 years later, we have a record of where these objects were. Come up with a better story next time. All right. And then we also know that the defendant sends a message to Khan after he leaves on June 28th saying she can't connect through her phone to the system. And then Khan shoots off an email to his tech support saying, can you help Ms. Sementilli, please? And then a couple minutes later, she sends back, I got it, with exclamation point, thanks, meaning she can live stream her surveillance feed from anywhere, as he testified. And he also testified, if you recall, that data spikes from her internet service provider records would indicate that she accessed and live streamed her home surveillance video cameras, which would show you traffic on her home IP bandwidth. We brought in those records, we put those together, and all of that was testified to by Curtis Davis regarding the defendant checking her home surveillance cameras on the day of the murder. Again, a coincidence? At approximately 4 p.m. Not a coincidence. We also learned that Fabio didn't have that app on his cell phone, which was item number 67. And we also heard from the daughters that they knew their mother did. Yet, what does the defendant do? She tells law enforcement when they ask her, again, this is the woman who so desperately wants to find the killers who did this to her husband. She desperately wants to figure out who did this crime, right? That's why she's calling law enforcement day after day after day. It's not to pump them for information, silly people. But what does she tell them? She lies. She says, oh, I never was able to do that. We got this new system. I was never able to connect to the home surveillance system through my iPhone. So again, come up with some, again, innocent explanation that is reasonable. Come up with one. I'd love to hear it when you're all done. Come up with one innocent explanation why the defendant lies to law enforcement about the fact that she's able to access her home security surveillance cameras from her iPhone. We know she's done it because we also subpoenaed, there's a lot of records in this case, we also subpoenaed the records that show that she connected to her home surveillance system on several other dates, not many. I think there's about maybe half a dozen, and the last time prior to, coincidentally, the day of the murder is November 10th of the year before. So also give me a good explanation or an innocent explanation that has to also, as I told you, be reasonable under the law as to why she chose to check the cameras that day at approximately 4 o'clock, right after she tells Jessica that she shouldn't be late to babysit. So again, I'll tell you the non-innocent, reasonable explanation, and that I assume you already know is because, again, she's trying to distance herself from the system as a whole because she utilized it to provide information to Baker on when the coast was clear for him to come and commit the murder after Jessica left. And you can look at exhibits 136 through 139 for that. Now, the same day that the defendant received the email from Khan, and 2 minutes after getting access on her phone that I just showed you, I got it, thanks. 2 minutes later, she logs on and onto her computer, and she forwards the logon instructions, as you heard, her password, her user ID, the Sementilli Wi-Fi address. She emails all of that to Robert Baker. Again, come up with an innocent yet reasonable explanation for why she would do that. And then, also, you're going to have to explain this one away too. Then she does something, again, that I told you she does over and over. What does she do? She deletes the email to Baker. Because again, by deleting the information, she can claim, I never did such a thing, right? And so she deletes the email from her sent email box, her Hotmail box. Of course, then I subpoena the Hotmail records, and we get records that you heard Officer Curtis Davis went through, and he recovers the deleted email. And you heard that out of the thousands of files in her email system, the only item she deleted from her Hotmail account was this email that she sent to Baker and Fabio's itineraries for business trips. Okay? 4 of them in total out of thousands. Coincidence? Or do I hit the button? Okay, no takers. And then, of course, we get Baker on the stand, and he acknowledges that...
I'm going to object to no takers implies the
That was improper.
jury can respond.
That was improper.
And then, I was being sarcastic, and then Baker acknowledged that he had access to her security cameras from his phone and computers, meaning that he, in fact, was able to download the application from the App Store. There's, as you heard, IDMSS Lite is the app that for your Apple phone. There's also an Android version that Officer Davis talked about. And Baker's explanation, his innocent explanation is, well, that was just so that, you know, we could wave to each other from the cameras, right? So, given the overwhelming evidence of a murder conspiracy in this case between the defendant and Robert Baker and Mr. Austin, again, there is no reasonable explanation for why she sends this to Baker. And remember, this is June 28th of 2016. And then deletes it from her phone. Again, more information, more evidence showing you that she's an active participant in the plan to kill her husband. And here's that information, which you can see in various exhibits. Now, you also heard that on that same date of the install, June 28th of 2016, Baker's Samsung S4 connects to the Sementilli's Wi-Fi, which means he's either at the location or near the location, so that he connects and he inputs the Sementilli Wi-Fi, probably because he's there to ensure that the information she just sent him works, and he's able to connect after that to the Sementilli home Wi-Fi. Now, we know later on that same night as the install, June 28th of 2016, Sam Pulera's in town, and he was in town on business, and he went to the Sementilli home that night to see the defendant and to see Fabio. And Fabio had just come home from an OPI event that day to find the new security system, the new DVR in place, and this is Exhibit 198. And you heard that Fabio was joking around with Sam, and he says to Sam, "I came home to this." We also know that Fabio that day was at an event in, I believe it was Los Angeles, because he posts on his Instagram account photographs of, men aren't going to know what this is, women do. This is OPI nail polish. OPI is a brand that's owned by Wella, and he writes, "My wife and daughters don't know it yet, but Big Daddy is bringing home a few treats from OPI." And it's on his Instagram account, FabStyle67. And so he's photographing while he's at this event that he's bringing home gifts for his wife and his girls. And the defendant is there, and she says to Sam, "Well, you know, Sam, this isn't Woodbridge. You can never be too safe," right? The following month, in July, we know the defendant discussed with Baker that she was going to be in Las Vegas with Fabio, as we already talked about, for the Wella Trendsetters event at the Arya. And we know this is one of the 4 deleted items in her Hotmail account, along with the logon instructions from First Digital. The other 3, as I told you, were itineraries relating to Fabio's business trips, and one of them is this itinerary that also has, somebody's taken a pen and drawn in a map on the map with an arrow on where to meet. And so she sends this to Baker, and so she and Baker obviously are planning their meetup at the Arya while Fab is working. This is Exhibit 216. We know, as I talked about already, that Baker makes plans with Austin to fly in from Alaska, sends him money to do so. We know that Baker picks up Austin at LAX. This is information regarding the airfare. And then we know that Baker meets up with the defendant, and he says actually on 2 different dates during this trip, while they're all in Las Vegas together at the same time at the Arya, where he claims Christopher Austin was in a different part of the hotel. And then we also heard Cy Ray testify that based on his review of all the cellular data, Baker and Austin were together at the Arya, along with the defendant, which he said was an extremely unique pattern to see all 3 of them together at the same location from reviewing all of their call detail records. Also, what Cy Ray tells us that we did not know, and I asked Baker about it, and he acted like he didn't know what I was talking about. Cy tells us, just as was the case on January 22nd of 2017, before Baker and Austin leave Baker's apartment to drive to the strip mall, Monica calls Baker. Here, just prior to their meetup at the Arya, again, the defendant calls Baker at 10:59 a.m., again, to tell him, obviously, where she's waiting. And we know Fabio's down the strip at another hotel that day. And we also have Baker's bank records confirming that he had card purchases at the Arya on a couple different days, as well as various charges while he's there in Las Vegas during the same time period. And if all that wasn't enough, we also have photographic evidence knowing that the defendant's there. She's there with her stepsister, Morella. They were very close until the defendant's arrest in this case. And we have Sal Macheri on the stage speaking at the event on the left. And you heard from various individuals such as Sal Macheri, Morella, Melanie Garibay, all talking about how Fabio and all of them were very busy working during the day, and so Monica would have had plenty of free time. And then, of course, we know that on July 26th, the defendant returns to Los Angeles, per se re, before Fabio does, and Austin testified, and the records show that Baker and Austin go over to the defendant's home that night. The defendant shows him the patio where Fabio spent a lot of time, and we know he watches television there, and he falls asleep while Monica and Baker go into the master bedroom. We also know that, as I talked about earlier, November 3rd of 2016, Baker messages Michael Spence, and notice here, again, in the messages where, as Sheila said, the girls never came up, he's basically saying that the daughters are going off to school, so they, meaning he and the defendant, will be free and clear of them. Again, they're not part of the future equation that Monica and Baker are building. The photograph that I've talked about several times from November of 2016, where she's writing Mrs. Baker on the mirror, which is evidence of her future intent. We've already talked about the text messages between Ron Ray and Baker, and we've also talked about Cy Ray and his testimony regarding the volume of communications between the defendant and Baker. And Cy Ray's charts of the communications, that's Exhibit 255. Again, looking at this particular exhibit, we know that while Baker wants you to believe that they both coincidentally decided to together stop using the Viber app on January 23rd because it became glitchy, they managed to send approximately 280 messages via Viber between the two dates of January 22nd, where they attempted to kill Fabio, and January 23rd, when they were finally successful. A couple weeks prior to Fabio's murder, we heard about the spike in communications when the defendant and Baker start to nail down the date of when this murder is going to happen, and that the defendant wants it done. And there's the communications back and forth between them and between Baker and Austin, and also at some point Al Birdsong is on the records, and this is the communications timeline from January 11th to the January 13th of 2017, and between that time period there's 445 communications on Viber, including texts and calls, and this is Exhibit 243. Here, Exhibit 261, this corroborates Austin's testimony. As I was talking about, the defendant wanted Fabio dead before he left for a business trip the end of January, which again, information had to come from the defendant, and you need to ask yourself again, what's the innocent explanation on why the defendant needs to send itineraries for Fabio's schedule to Baker, along with the password and DVR instructions. We know that on January 12th and 13th, Austin purchases his airline tickets to fly to LA, subsequent to their conversations about nailing down the dates. And we know that something very important came up while Austin was still up in Vancouver, Washington, long before any type of negotiations were made with his lawyer, or there was any serious conversation and documentation with respect to anything. While he's still up, the day he's arrested in Vancouver, Washington, he tells his cellmate, he's the first one in this case, Baker's never said it until he said at some point later to the defense investigators he knew that Monica was trying to get the insurance money. But this time, Austin, for the first time again, just like he mentioned January 22nd of 2017, which we never knew about, he tells the undercover officer in his cell on October 2nd that before he flew into Los Angeles for the purpose of killing Fabio, that the entire purpose of the murder was so that Baker's girlfriend could collect on the victim's life insurance policy. And that...
Sorry, I need to interrupt you.
Sorry, can I finish that one sentence?
Please.
And that he goes on to confirm that later in his proffer in November when he's brought down to Los Angeles in 2024. Thank you, Your Honor.
Let's take our lunch recess until 1:30. As always, the admonition applies. Have a good lunch.